They called it the whisper of hell. Long before the gunfire started, soldiers could feel it, that heavy silence before the roar. And when it came, it wasn't bullets that ripped through the air, it was fire. A living, breathing wave of it, swallowing bunkers, jungles, and men in seconds. The flamethrower wasn't just a weapon, it was a nightmare you could see, hear, and smell. Even the bravest soldiers froze when its hiss filled the air. Machine guns could kill, but fire erased. It didn't just take life, it consumed everything that made you human. In World War II, one weapon turned the battlefield into a furnace. And those who faced it never forgot the sound of burning air. This is the story of the weapon that was feared more than any gun, America's flamethrower. World War II was not only a battle of nations, it was a battle of invention, desperation, and fear. Every army sought the edge that could break the enemy's spirit before it broke their body. For America, that edge came in the form of a weapon born from pure terror, the flamethrower. While machine guns ruled the open fields of Europe, the jungles of the Pacific demanded something darker. Japanese soldiers dug deep into caves, bunkers, and tunnels, invisible, silent, and waiting. Conventional weapons couldn't reach them. But fire could. With one pull of the trigger, a stream of burning fuel turned those hiding places into infernos. To some, the flamethrower was a tool of victory. To others, it was a glimpse into humanity's darkest side, a weapon that didn't just kill, but purged. This wasn't just about combat. It was about psychological warfare, where the sight of a man carrying a tank of fire on his back struck more terror than an entire squad with rifles. And in that fire, the world saw how far man was willing to go, not just to win a war, but to dominate fear itself. The idea of using fire as a weapon was as old as war itself. Ancient armies hurled flaming arrows and poured boiling oil from castle walls. But in the 20th century, fire was reborn, engineered, pressurized, and carried on the backs of men. It became the flamethrower, a weapon designed not just to destroy, but to terrify. America's use of the flamethrower didn't begin in the Pacific. Its roots stretched back to the grim trenches of World War I, where German engineers first unleashed the Flammenwerfer. It spewed fire like a dragon's breath, forcing soldiers from their bunkers and trenches in blind panic. The Allies had never seen anything like it, a weapon that turned courage into smoke. When World War II erupted, the United States studied that same terror and decided to master it. The U.S. Army developed its own versions, the M1 and later the M2 flamethrower. They were crude, heavy, and dangerous, even for those who carried them. A full tank weighed nearly 70 pounds, filled with a sticky, gasoline-based fuel that could shoot up to 40 yards. One stray bullet, one spark, and the operator himself could become a human torch. Yet, despite the danger, volunteers stepped forward. They were often small, agile men, chosen because they could move fast and carry the massive fuel tank through mud, jungles, and rubble. These soldiers were nicknamed fire demons, or torchmen, and they quickly learned that fear was their most powerful weapon. When the U.S. Marines landed in the Pacific, they found themselves facing a new kind of battlefield, one hidden in shadows. Japanese soldiers built entire fortresses underground, tunnels, caves, and pillboxes reinforced with rock and steel. No bullet could reach them. No grenade could flush them out. But fire could crawl into the darkness and force the enemy into the open. That's when the flamethrower earned its reputation. In training camps across Hawaii and California, young Americans learned to wield fire as a tool of precision. They were taught how to ignite bunkers, burn supply caches, and even create smokescreens of burning vapor. The first time they pulled the trigger, most hesitated, not from weakness, but from the realization that they were holding the power of annihilation. The roar of the flamethrower was unlike any sound on Earth. It wasn't a bang like a rifle or the boom of artillery, it was a growl, deep and unholy, echoing through jungles and hearts alike. Soldiers on both sides would later say that when the flamethrower was unleashed, the battlefield itself seemed to scream. By 1943, this weapon was no longer just experimental, it had become an integral part of American assault tactics. Portable, fearsome, and unstoppable in close quarters, the flamethrower would soon become the most feared weapon in the Pacific, setting the stage for one of the darkest chapters of the war. The Pacific theater was unlike any battlefield the world had ever seen. The air was thick with humidity, the ground swallowed men whole, and the jungles seemed alive with shadows. For American soldiers, the enemy wasn't just Japan, it was the very landscape itself. Each island was a fortress, and each fortress was alive with unseen death. The Japanese soldiers had mastered the art of invisibility. They built underground tunnels and cave networks that stretched for miles, hidden beneath the dense canopy. Entire platoons could vanish beneath the earth, only to reappear behind enemy lines. Machine guns, mortars, and grenades failed to root them out. The only weapon that could reach them, that could crawl through the cracks and suffocate the hidden, was fire. And so, the flamethrower became the Americans' weapon of choice in this hellish war. When the Marines stormed Iwo Jima, Saipan, and Okinawa, the flamethrower teams were always at the front. Their job was simple but horrifying: advance, locate the bunker, and turn it into a furnace. On Iwo Jima, the black volcanic sands burned beneath the feet of men carrying fuel tanks on their backs. One Marine remembered the feeling vividly: you could hear them screaming inside the caves, and sometimes, they'd never come out. The fire didn't just kill, it devoured oxygen, suffocated lungs, melted steel, and consumed everything in its path. The Japanese defenders called it the demon's breath. Inside the caves, temperatures soared to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The flames clung to stone, to flesh, to everything. There was no escape, no hiding. Even soldiers who tried to surrender sometimes found their shelters already turned into blazing tombs. The American flamethrower teams were seen as both heroes and executioners. They carried the burden of being necessary, but monstrous. Every mission tested their humanity. Some operators admitted that they felt sick after each attack. Others said they couldn't allow themselves to think, if they hesitated, they'd be dead. The M2 flamethrower became the most refined version, slightly lighter, with better fuel flow and range. But its psychological power was unmatched. The mere sound of its ignition would send entire enemy units fleeing from cover. Japanese soldiers often refused to be captured by flamethrower operators. They saw them as cursed, men who commanded hellfire itself. For the Americans, it wasn't just about destroying the enemy. It was survival. In those suffocating jungles, hesitation meant death. The enemy hid in the earth, in trees, in the darkness. Fire was the only thing that could flush them out. As one U.S. Marine put it, if you didn't burn them, they'd kill you from the shadows tomorrow. At Okinawa, the last great battle of the Pacific, the flamethrowers turned hillsides into volcanoes. American engineers even mounted them on tanks, creating the Flame Sherman, a monstrous machine that could spit fire over 100 yards. The psychological toll was immense. Even hardened veterans said they would rather face artillery or snipers than the sound of that weapon igniting. But behind the tactical success was a darker truth: the weapon changed those who used it. Operators began to carry the smell of burnt fuel and ash everywhere they went. It clung to their uniforms, their hair, their memories. Some said they could never eat cooked meat again after seeing what the flames did to human bodies. And yet, in the unforgiving War of the Pacific, mercy was a luxury no one could afford. The flamethrower wasn't just efficient, it was final. It erased the enemy so completely that sometimes, nothing was left to bury. The jungles that once hid death were now lit with a new kind of light, orange, blinding, and merciless. And in that light, the soldiers learned a terrible truth: the closer you stand to fire, the harder it is to feel human. The Pacific Campaign had become a place where fire ruled over fear, and where victory itself began to look like madness. Behind every flamethrower was not a monster, but a man, a soldier who carried hell on his back and prayed that it wouldn't explode before he reached the target. These men were not chosen for glory. They were chosen for endurance, for nerve, for the ability to walk into a storm of bullets carrying a tank of death. The flamethrower operators of World War II lived a life of constant tension. They knew they were the most visible, the most targeted men on the battlefield. Japanese snipers were trained to eliminate them first. A single shot to the fuel tank could turn them into a pillar of fire in an instant. And yet, they went forward, every time. Many were volunteers, men who believed in doing the hardest jobs because someone had to. They trained for months, learning to control the fire's reach, its pressure, and its unpredictable temperament. They learned how to ignite bunkers without trapping themselves in the blaze, how to advance through smoke so thick it turned day into night, and how to breathe when the air was filled with burning fuel. One Marine flamethrower operator, Private Wilburn Ross, once said, "When you pull that trigger, you stop thinking. You just become the fire." That was the mindset, a terrifying fusion of man and weapon. On the battlefield, they weren't just soldiers anymore. They were symbols, walking representations of American power and fear. But off the field, when the flames died down, they were haunted by what they had seen. Many could still hear the screams from the caves, the echoes of burning fuel hitting stone and flesh. Some wrote letters home describing their guilt. "I did my duty, but sometimes I wonder if I went too far." Others never spoke of it again, carrying the burden in silence. Even among their comrades, flamethrower operators were treated differently. There was respect, yes, but also distance. Men feared being near them, not just because of the danger of the fuel tanks, but because of what they represented. To see a flamethrower operator was to be reminded of what war could turn you into. And yet, their effectiveness could not be denied. In battle reports, commanders often noted that the presence of a single flamethrower team could decide the fate of an entire engagement. A bunker that might have taken hours to capture with rifles could be cleared in seconds with fire. But every victory came at a personal cost. The men who used the flamethrower often found themselves questioning what victory really meant. They weren't just killing the enemy, they were erasing them. There was no clean death, no dignity, no surrender. Just fire and silence. When the war ended, many of these soldiers returned home to a country that celebrated their heroism, but few understood their nightmares. They had survived the war, but the fire followed them into their dreams. Because when you carry the flame, you don't leave it behind. It leaves its mark, forever. As the war dragged toward its bloody conclusion, the flamethrower had already carved its name into the darkest pages of history. It was more than a weapon, it was a symbol of what modern warfare had become. In the Pacific, word spread quickly among Japanese soldiers: death by bullet was mercy, but death by fire was a curse. Prisoners of war often whispered that facing a flamethrower was like facing the gates of hell itself. The psychological power of this weapon was immense. Entire enemy positions would surrender at the mere sight of a flamethrower team advancing. The roar of the igniter, the thick smell of fuel, the orange reflection of flames on metal, it all struck fear deeper than any artillery shell could. Even American troops felt it. Some admitted that when a flamethrower was unleashed nearby, they would instinctively flinch or turn away. The weapon's terror didn't discriminate between sides. But as the war neared its end, questions began to rise. Was this weapon too cruel? Too inhuman? Newspapers back home celebrated victories, but buried the details of how those victories were achieved. Behind the headlines of heroism lay images of burned landscapes and soldiers broken by their own conscience. Commanders defended the weapon's use as necessary in total war, but privately, many officers confessed unease. Fire didn't just kill, it erased everything, including the line between justice and vengeance. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the world looked at the flamethrower differently. In Europe, it had been used sparingly. In the Pacific, it had defined the fight. Historians began calling it the most psychologically devastating weapon of the Second World War. It created panic, despair, and surrender faster than any bomb. And that, perhaps, was its true power, not destruction, but domination of the human spirit. In the years following the war, the flamethrower faced moral scrutiny. Some called it a war crime. Others said it saved thousands of American lives by ending battles quicker. The U.S. military continued to refine it through Korea and Vietnam, but each decade brought more condemnation. Images of villages engulfed in fire turned global opinion against it. By the late 20th century, the flamethrower had been all but banned under international law, labeled a relic of a darker age. Yet its legacy endures. Museums display the M2 flamethrower behind glass now, harmless, silent, almost surreal. But those who know its history understand the weight it carries. It reminds us that war is not only fought with bullets and bombs, but with fear itself. The flamethrower turned fear into a weapon, one that burned as brightly in the human mind as it did on the battlefield. And as veterans grew old, many would say the same thing when asked about the weapon: it won battles, but it cost us a piece of our humanity. When the fires of World War II finally faded, the flamethrower was left standing as one of its most haunting symbols. It represented both the triumph of human ingenuity, and the abyss that ingenuity could open when guided by fear. For America, it was a weapon of victory; for those who faced it, it was the face of horror itself. The flamethrower taught a brutal lesson: war isn't just about who shoots faster or who has the bigger gun. It's about who can break the other's spirit first. On the battlefields of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Peleliu, fire became the language of dominance, and terror was the grammar that shaped it. Soldiers who once believed in honor and courage discovered something darker, that even the strongest hearts could tremble before a weapon that devoured everything it touched. But long after the battles ended, the flame refused to die. It burned quietly in the memories of those who survived, in the nightmares of operators who carried its roar in their ears, and in the conscience of a world that had witnessed its power. Every flicker of fire, every hiss of fuel, reminded them of what humanity was capable of when pushed too far. In the end, the flamethrower was more than a tool of war. It was a mirror. It showed mankind not what we could build, but what we could become when consumed by hate and necessity. Today, the flamethrower rests in museums, behind glass and warning signs. Silent. Cold. But those who stand before it can still feel its presence, the echo of a time when fear burned brighter than courage. Because in war, the deadliest weapon isn't always the one that kills the body. Sometimes, it's the one that scars the soul. The story of America's flamethrower isn't just history, it's a reminder. A reminder that every weapon ever made carries the weight of the hands that used it, and the screams of those who faced it. In the fires of World War II, nations learned how far they could go to win, and how much of their humanity they could lose in the process. As the smoke cleared, one truth remained: victory always comes with a cost. The flamethrower may have burned out decades ago, but its shadow still stretches across time, a symbol of how fear can be both a weapon and a warning. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that history isn't black and white, but made of flame and ash, then remember to subscribe and join our journey through the untold tales of war. Because every forgotten story, every silenced scream, and every hidden act of courage deserves to be heard. This was WW2 Tales, where the past still burns, and every flame tells a story.